Hello, and a very warm welcome and a happy year of the ox to everyone tuning in for our discussion today. My name is John SEAMAN. I am a research fellow in the Center for Asian Studies at the French Institute of International Relations, or Ifri, and it is my pleasure to be chairing today's discussion on what allies, namely France and Japan, expect of and can expect from the Biden administration in Washington, which is still in many ways taking shape 1 month after the inauguration of the new American president. After 4 years of a unilateralist America First policy under Donald Trump, it is refreshing to see American foreign policy returning to a narrative of multilateral cooperation and engagement with allies. At the same time, while we have a bedrock of common interests and core values to work from, Washington shouldn't expect that the last 4 years will just be easily swept under the rug and forgotten. So moving forward, there are many potential pitfalls to cooperation, ranging from digital and technology policy to re-engaging on a deal with Iran's nuclear program, to what is likely to be an elephant in the room of today's discussion, and that is finding the right mix of policy prescriptions in dealing with China. So today's discussion will be particularly instructive in that we will be looking at the relations with Washington from two very different yet similar perspectives. On the one hand, Japan is a linchpin in the US alliance network in the Pacific, and has viewed the rise of China with a greater sense of urgency in recent years than perhaps we have here in Europe. In many ways, Tokyo's alliance with Washington is unshakable. Paris, meanwhile, has often been a thorn in the side of Washington in the past, but has nevertheless been drawn ever more closely into the US orbit over the last decade, particularly on security and defense issues. Still, concepts that France is championing, such as strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty for Europe, particularly in relationship to the United States, are gaining considerable momentum and making waves across the Atlantic. In this sense, it will be interesting to have a Japanese view on the course of the transatlantic relations as well. Of course, one area where Paris and Tokyo increasingly converge is in their relationship with Washington, is in the development of an Indo-Pacific strategic concept, which we will get to in a bit. So, Joe Biden says that America is back and looking to engage more constructively with partners in a multilateral setting. But beyond this broad change in tone, what do key allies expect from Washington? To delve into this topic and put some meat on today's discussion, we have an excellent panel lined up for you. We'll begin by looking at the Japanese and French expectations toward the Biden administration. And for this, we are pleased and honored to be joined by Professor Kunihiko MIYAKE and Ambassador Pierre Vimont. After an illustrious career in the Japanese diplomatic service, Professor MIYAKE has been a key foreign policy advisor to the Japanese government for many years. Today, he is president of the Foreign Policy Institute, a private think tank in Tokyo. He's also research director for foreign and national security affairs at the Canon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo, and a special advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister Suga's cabinet. Professor MIYAKE, welcome, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you again. From the French and European side, we are pleased to have Ambassador Pierre Vimont with us after a distinguished 38-year career in the French diplomatic corps, where he was, among many other things, ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2010. Ambassador Vimont was the Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service from 2010 to 2015, and is now a senior associate with Carnegie Europe, where he focuses on European neighborhood policy, transatlantic relations, and French foreign policy. Ambassador Vimont, a very warm welcome to you, and thanks for joining us here today as well. So after exploring the Japanese and French expectations towards Washington in their respective bilateral contexts, we'll broaden the scope a bit and look at regional and multilateral cooperation frameworks, and in particular the Indo-Pacific concept, which was championed by Japan, bought by the French, bought by the Trump administration, and now seems to have survived the transition and remains a key conceptual narrative of the Biden administration. It has also entered into the French and increasingly the European lexicon. So to discuss this, we're equally pleased and honored to be joined by Professor Yoko Iwama and my esteemed colleague at Ifri, Céline Pajon. Professor Iwama is a professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Japan, where she currently is director of 3 programs dealing with strategic and international studies. She is a specialist of international politics and European diplomatic history, especially NATO and its evolution. And today she'll be sharing her views and analysis on dealing with China in the context of NATO in particular. So Professor Iwama, thank you for taking the time to join us here today, and a very warm welcome to you as well. Last and certainly not least, we'll hear from Céline Pajon, who for many of you needs no introduction. Céline is the head of the Japan research at the Center for Asian Studies here at Ifri. She is specialized in Japanese foreign and defense policies, and is currently doing some great work analyzing the international relations and geostrategic setting of the Indo-Pacific. She is also a senior associate of the Japan program at the Free University of Brussels, or VUB, and an international research fellow with the Canon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo. And I might add that Céline is the one who has done all the legwork in getting today's discussion up and running. So thank you for being here to share your thoughts, Céline, but also thank you very much for putting this all together. So let's get cracking. To begin, each speaker will have about 10 minutes, hopefully no more than 10 minutes, let's put it at that, to provide some initial remarks. And before I hand the floor over to them, let me also remind everyone in the audience that this is a public discussion, and that members of the audience are welcome and encouraged to put their questions to the panelists using the Q&R function here in Zoom. And I'll do my best to pick those up with the help of some of my colleagues and to relay those on to our panelists. So without further ado, Professor MIYAKE, why don't you start us off with some thoughts on what you see as Japan's expectations for the Biden administration and the future of the US-Japan alliance. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Great to see you all. I have only 10 minutes that I like to share with you some of my personal thoughts. I'm not saying anything in my capacity as special advisor of something. I don't care, but it is on the record, so I have to be serious. First of all, Mr. Biden said America is back. I hope America is back. Probably they won't be back to where they used to belong. Maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago. Now the America is changing. But one thing is for sure, Biden administration, Washington, D.C. is back. The people who've been in Obama administration or Clinton administration, those people are coming back. And they are familiar friends of ours. They know, we know how to deal with them. Sometimes they can be nasty, but sometimes they are very powerful and helpful. So we are getting back to Washington. Washington is back. But having said that, I think what we expect from the United States is very traditional. We've been status quo power in the Western Pacific for the past 70 years. And we will continue to be so. And we don't want anybody to change the status quo in the wrong direction. So in a sense, of course, Professor Iwama will address this later, but the US foreign policy vis-a-vis China has started to change in the second Obama administration. So it's relatively new. And they started changing, and Trump administration followed, and the Obama administration, Biden administration is in a good sense, the third Obama term, third term of the Obama administration. So it's good to know. One thing I am a little bit concerned about is the Mr. Biden's advisor's remarks about the middle class. Somebody said, I think it was Mr. Sullivan, said that U.S. foreign policy should win the respect of the middle class of the United States. What does it mean? It means, in a good sense, they said, in order to be able to compete with China, we should have a strong economy, domestic economy. Fine, but it sounds like another America First policy. I hope it's not going to be the case. But there are some difficulties, and of course, we never be successful in dealing with the American administration for decades. It's always a headache, always a good time, always a bad time. But the expectation is higher. It's getting higher and higher. But having said that, I don't know much about France, but there are some Trumpists, Trump lovers, even in Japan. To my surprise, they are not white supremacists. They are not racist, but there are certain people who still believe that the election was stolen in the United States, and they still believe that Mr. Trump is the president. And I don't know why. I thought about it, but probably those are the people who are really concerned about China, and those people really appreciated the U.S. policy vis-a-vis China under the Trump administration. Probably that is the major reasons why, one of the major reasons why they still believe that Trump is president. But in a sense, Mr. Trump administration was a very difficult administration to deal with anyway, for everybody. But probably for Mr. Abe, he's the only one of the few exceptions in the world who could deal with Mr. Trump in a very sophisticated way. So we were lucky as compared to the situation in NATO. Probably we've been much luckier. And now we have more expectation, and I think the Biden administration spend more, will focus on the international cooperation and the importance of the alliance system. So I am very optimistic, and there is a sense of relief in Tokyo, and we look forward to working with them. But having said that, the devil's in details. It's good that Mr. Biden talk about the reorganization of the U.S. foreign services. State Department will be back, and also Mr. Biden gave a speech at the Pentagon on the I think 10th of February, just 7 days ago, and he established the China Task Force. Those are the great moves. But having said that, that means there will be some areas we might find it difficult to deal with. I mean, for example, if they have a task force on China, and if they reorganize or rewrite or review their policy vis-a-vis China, the force posture, the roles and missions, and the host nation support. Those things are, if they're going to work on and review it and try to do something new, then probably not only Japan, but allies in East Asia may find it more difficult politically, probably domestic political reasons. It might be difficult for us to catch up with them. But having said that, the danger is already in the Western Pacific. We have Senkaku in the East China Sea, and they have military installations in the South China Sea, and you have problems in the Indian Ocean. So I think the more focus should be put on the Indo-Pacific concept. Biden administration seems to be upholding the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So that's good. But as I said, the devil's in details. And we may have to tackle so many difficult questions to in the years to come before we be able to deter whatever the moves to change the status quo in the Western Pacific. So I am very, very happy to take questions. Indeed, I mean, some specific questions later, but I just want to tell you that Suga administration and other, no matter what, who the prime minister would be, probably it is more, and it's getting easier and also more imperative to work with the United States in order to stabilize, continue stability in this part of the world. Thank you. And that concludes my remarks. It is 9 minutes and 30 seconds.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Professor MIYAKE. I think one of the key phrases that I caught from what you said is that the devil is in the details. So we've got basically a general tone that is set by the Biden administration, which is very much positive, but at the same time, once we start entering into the details of many of these issues in cooperation with the United States, we might find a fair amount of difficulty. So I would imagine that is probably also going to be the case in transatlantic relations as well. But I will turn over to somebody who knows much more about that than me, in Ambassador Vimont. So please, why don't you go ahead and give us a French perspective, French and European, whichever you would like to privilege more. You've got about 10 minutes. So please go ahead, Ambassador Vimont.
Thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me, and I will try to stay inside those 10 minutes framework. Because I think I've came here to listen as much as to talk, and to hear from all the great expertise that is there around the table. Let me just give you broadly a few observations, because on what Professor MIYAKE just said, I could go along on much of what he has said, and I would like to go just a little bit further maybe, because what strikes me is that from what he said, the Japanese perspective on the Biden administration is very much similar to what one can detect from the European or the French perspective at the moment. First of all, a sense of relief and hope with the Biden administration that to a large extent goes back to a more orderly, professional diplomacy, which was missing in these last 4 years. And for the Europeans and the French, I think this is very much welcome. But at the same time, as Professor MIYAKE was underlining, there is still a lot of information that is missing, and therefore some uncertainty about really where the Biden administration will go. It is normal, we're just at the beginning. But that it was rightly said, the devil may be in the details, and we will have to watch this very closely. One of the reasons why we have to be cautious as we move along is because I think personally that to think about this new US administration as a sort of Obama mandate 0.3, a sort of third mandate for the Obama administration, because we see many familiar faces. We know a lot of those who now have picked up the big, the important jobs in the Biden administration. There is this impression that we're going to go through a sort of revival of the former US foreign policy under President Obama. I think this will not be the case for two main reasons. One, because the world has changed, and because whatever one may think about many of the foreign policy decisions taken by the Trump administration, it has had some impact. Think about the Middle East, think about the relationship with China, of course. This strong confrontation with China, and this has left some trace. And therefore, we're picking up a world which is, the Biden administration is picking up a world which is in a totally different shape than it was before. And the second reason, and I think Professor MIYAKE alluded to that, is that from a domestic point of view, America has changed a lot also. I won't go back into what has been said, but we all have seen the attack on the Capitol. We all have heard about the extreme right factions that are there. And my point is that it's not only about America, it's also about many of our countries where the middle classes have suffered a lot from the globalization and what has gone on. And therefore, there is this sense of frustration in many of our countries, certainly in France. We can see it in many other European countries, Italy, Poland, Hungary, and many others. And I think this has to be taken into account, definitely. Having said that, and my third administration is that the first signs and the first decisions that have been taken by the Biden administration seem to be going in the right direction. A strong sense of moving back into the multilateral frame. And I think we all can only rejoice at that prospect. But all the first decision on climate, moving back into the Paris Agreement, on the whole question of the fight against the virus, moving back in the WHO, on trade, supporting the election of the new Director General, on human rights, getting rid of the Muslim ban. There are signs that America could move back as an observer in the Human Rights Council. And on non-proliferation, with the decision to prolong the New START treaty with Russia. All this is moving in the right direction, and I think Europeans, and certainly France, can really rejoice about this trend that is moving in the right direction. I think also for the Europeans, the emphasis put by the new US administration on the need to revitalize the transatlantic partnership. And we will see it very soon with the conversation that Tony Blinken wants to have with his European colleagues as quickly as possible. And the next NATO meeting of foreign ministers will be very interesting from that point. So all this is, I would say, on the positive side. And there are many other signs, I think, that we could put forward that go in the same direction. Yet, if you look at the agenda that the European Union has set up on 4 or 5 main issues, one can see that there, when you go from one point to the other, there is need for more information and for a better understanding of where exactly this new US administration wants to go. Multilateral, I mentioned it very briefly, seems to be going in the right direction. But if you look at some other issues, trade, for instance, where we may have between the Europeans and the Americans still some strong differences of view on the whole issue about taxation on carbon, about taxation on digital industries, about the whole issue of the protection of personal data and how we're going to manage the increasing hegemony of digital platforms, many of them being American. We can expect, I think, some divergences there, and we will need to overcome these. But look at some of the more specific issues that we're facing at the moment in the European neighborhood, the relationship with Russia. How should we act with our American friends in countries like Ukraine, in the current confrontation between Armenia and Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh? How are we going to move together with our American allies on the future of the JCPOA and our relation with Iran? How are we going to move in our relation with some of our partners in the Gulf region on the Middle East peace process between Israel and the Palestinians? How are we going to work together on Syria and on Libya? In all this neighborhood of the European Union, be it east or south, we have many difficult issues that we need to tackle. And we don't know exactly where our American friends stand on this one. And we will have to work this out as we move along together. We have the whole issue also of security and defense. And when the Europeans are trying to build up what they call their strategic autonomy, and you know the French are very eager to push forward, some of our European member states may still have some reservations because they fear that strategic autonomy equals drifting slowly away from NATO and from our American ally. And we need here again to find a common ground on which to move forward and to avoid any misunderstanding with our American partners on this issue. It will be at the end of the day about complementarity, but it will be also about the Europeans being able to work on their own if need be. And lastly, but I have kept this for the end of course, it's all about our partnership and relationship with China. And you know that here there may have been already some misgivings from the American side because the Europeans have gone ahead with their agreement on investment with China, where maybe Washington was eager for the Europeans to wait and stay put and wait a while. And of course, the Europeans have answered that call from Washington by reminding them precisely that we wanted to be autonomous, that some countries in Asia had gone ahead with their own RCEP, and there was no need to be worried about Europe, that we were very cautious in our approach towards China. And the French, more than anybody else inside Europe, are very eager to push an Indo-Pacific strategy at the level of the European Union. But still, we want to have our own mindset on this and our own say in these affairs. And this is where also we may find ourselves at some point having to discuss more with America in order to avoid misunderstanding, misgivings, and to find a way forward. I'll stop there. I've been too long, but I wanted to sketch out these first observations before we go further ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. That was very rich. Thank you very much, Ambassador Vimont. I think maybe there are lots of questions that come out of this. I think you raised a lot of very open-ended questions that we still need to put to the Americans. I think perhaps later in this discussion, I'd like to come back to both of you to think about. So maybe you can think about this already. What sort of advice you would give to the Biden administration in terms of how to approach its allies? There's still, Ambassador Vimon, you give a very long list of open-ended questions and uncertainties. So I would imagine that any American colleagues who might be listening in might be very interested in what sort of advice you might have in how to approach us as allies. You also touched on something very quick, and I would like to go back to Professor Miyake, perhaps just for maybe even 30-second reaction regarding the European investment agreement with China. And Ambassador Vimon also talked about the RCEP, the RCEP. How is this investment agreement? I mean, we've had a lot of conversation in the transatlantic community about how the Americans are not very happy about Europe moving forward on this. But what's the Japanese perspective?
Well, it is not inappropriate to try to make a deal with China on the economic arena. But what concerns us most is not economy. What we are concerned about is security and stability and geopolitical sort of interest rather than the pure economic money. Okay, this is my answer.
Okay, that's very straightforward, and I think that makes a good transition actually into Professor Iwama, who will discuss more of this hard security aspect in relation to NATO and the discussion on China within the NATO context. So Professor Iwama, I will turn it over directly to you, and Ambassador Vimon, and maybe Professor Miyake, you want to start thinking a bit more about this advice question that I gave to you, and we'll find our way back to you in a little bit. But Professor Iwama, why don't you open us up on this discussion?
Right. Thank you, Jean. And I'd like to thank Ifri for inviting me to this seminar. So exciting to be at a place which has been associated with so many great French strategists. So Celine has invited me to speak about Biden administration, NATO, and China. I think the two former speakers has set the right tone, and I would like to pick up with the expression relief and hope, but caution. I think that's the right tone we have also for NATO and Europe, their attitudes towards China. As Mr. Miyake just said, Japan has been very much concerned about Europe's unawareness of Chinese security threat, for many years now. Last year was actually perceived by many as a kind of a turning point when Europe woke up to China, both in terms of EU and NATO. And we have been seeing more and more mention about China in NATO circles, and also in EU, but I'll come back to you later on. If you were in and out of Brussels as a Japanese, you have been in one of the meetings where you really tried hard to convince the Europeans that you should not lift the arms embargo towards China. That was a few years ago. And it was interesting a few weeks ago, the Japanese Foreign Ministry, its archive, released documents relating to the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident. And there it was very clear that the Japanese Foreign Ministry, Jiminto, and also Japanese government decided quite quickly that it was not appropriate to press China too hard on this issue, and that they wanted not to isolate China, and they wanted more engagement, and that it was Japan's role to play that bridge function, whereas Europe and also US was under strong domestic pressure to punish China for doing what it did. And so it was in this incident that EU arms embargo was established. And at the beginning, Japan was kind of reserved. But as time went on, around about 2000 something, we became more concerned about China than the Europeans, whereas the Europeans were seeing China as a big economic opportunity. We were more and more concerned about the emerging threat of rising China. And so we were pressing them not to lift the arms embargo and piling up all kinds of argument, everything possible to convince Europeans. And it was rather hard. I remember many meetings where it was rather hard to do so. And suddenly the winds are changing, which is welcome. And we feel relief and hope, but we're also cautious, still very cautious. And I'm still very cautious. About the relief and hope, and we're talking about NATO here. So I'll mention some of the strategic reviews that's going on in NATO. The keyword is NATO 2030. And there we have seen recently 2 reports released by a panel of specialists and also the young leaders. And it's quite refreshing to see that NATO mentioning China as security challenge, and that which needs much more attention than it did before. But what is quite different from Japan's approach is that it's always, not always, but mostly mentioned together with Russia. It is usually Russia and China, but definitely China is mentioned also by itself. Now, I tried to count how many times China was mentioned in NATO 2030 report, and it was 82 times, and Russia was mentioned 96 times. And then I turned to the young leaders report, which seemed to be much more straightforward than the elderly people's report. But here again, China was mentioned 11 times, Russia 17 times. So it was very proportionate. I found it quite interesting. I think it's appropriate that NATO and Europe is concerned more with Russia than with China because of its geostrategic position. But at the same time, seen from Japan's point of view, I think although Russia and China are both kind of an authoritarian regime, it poses a completely different type of challenge to us, especially in the technological threshold that we are in currently, and I think the pandemic is going to accelerate the changes that we're going to see, where things are going to be merged in cyberspace. I mean, the very fact that we are doing this here in this manner, using Zoom, tells us something. And China has a lot to do with these kind of technologies, which poses different kind of security threat, which is different from the sort of heavy tank-oriented and the missiles and nuclear weapons dominated security world that NATO is accustomed to and is still very much sort of focused on, I think. So there's a lot of talk about missile defense and INF, even conventional weapons treaty, but we are moving also into a different world, and we need to focus what really poses, what kind of challenge that this new world is posing us. Now, so that's one concern, understanding China correctly. And another concern is that there's a lot of difference in the way that European countries approach China. And I don't have to bring out Japanese opinion. It was Philip Stephens from Financial Times who several days ago, wrote a piece called "Joe Biden Should Look to Emmanuel Macron for a European Ally. Angela Merkel's Atlanticism ranks behind Germany's business interests in China and Russia." And I only need to mention keywords like Nord Stream 2 and the investment agreement with China, the EU agreement, which Merkel did a lot to push through. And I saw a press conference related to this that she was saying very simply, Mr. Biden serves the interests of the United States and I serve the interests of Germany. And I guess that's true economically. But then again, you have to focus on the nature of security, where technology is increasingly changing, which poses a huge challenge for all of us. By the way, this Philip Stefan's article was translated into Japanese and was appeared in this morning's Nikkei Shimbun. So we are watching with interest. So I'm gradually running out of time. Now, I'd be quite interested to hear your opinion, Celine's opinion about Emmanuel Macron being a reliable European ally, but I'll leave it to her. So I should gradually move towards concluding. Now, of course, we are kind of very, very wary towards China. I'm rather concerned that there's been very little report about the new Chinese Coast Guard law that was that went into force very recently. And so this is a very concrete strategic challenge that we're facing. At the same time, we are both very much reliant on Chinese economy, and especially with this pandemic depressing so much of our economy, we will be more than before reliant on the Chinese economy for the comeback. But I think we need to be careful and think strategically there about our interdependence, that we don't make ourselves too one-sidedly, asymmetrically dependent on China, that we keep our leverage. And to do that, I think we really need to go back and do our homework. Both France and Japan is rather falling behind in terms of industry and technology, medicine, everything. That has really been focused in this crisis. We've been one of the leading countries a few decades ago, but we are not there anymore. And I think it is really important that France is strong in social, economic, and political terms in Europe, that it does not become the junior partner of Germany. And that is really important for us, for Japan, that we have a lot of partners to talk to, not one dominant partner. So I think we both need to go back to home and think about competitiveness, reform, effectiveness, that kind of thing, to compete with China and all the other big powers in the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Iwama. I think you you also sort of answered my question about the investment agreement and what how this can be viewed from Japan. I think you did a very good job of sort of presenting things in terms of you know, not just a hard security aspect, but sort of these more geopolitical considerations and geoeconomic considerations that we need to take into account. Before I turn it over to Celine, I think I'd like to just come to you, Ambassador Vimont, for maybe a quick reaction to something that that Professor Iwama had said about the changing nature of security threats. And this reference that was made by President Macron about how NATO is essentially brain dead in terms of its perhaps its inability to think about the threats of the future. Would you have, Ambassador Vimont, perhaps you would have a quick reaction to that, or some thoughts on some of these things that have been said?
Yes, with pleasure, John. how to put it, because I could spend hours on NATO, of course, and I'll try to be short. I think, first of all, one must understand that President Macron's mention of the brain death of NATO was mostly related to NATO's relationship with Turkey. Turkey, as you know, being a member of NATO and at the same time being a somewhat unrestive ally, moving on its own, buying Russian equipments, increasing its presence and its influence in countries like Syria and Libya, somewhat opposing its own allies here and there. So that was the main stream of Macron's criticism towards NATO. The need to look boldly at where we may be facing contradiction and looking at the future. What came out of this was precisely the idea of setting up a sort of wise man committee that came up with a report that is going to feed the whole reflection on NATO 2030, and that will be very useful, I think. And it's true that in this discussion, Turkey became one element of a much broader conversation between NATO allies, relationship with Russia, the future of the strategic concept of NATO, and of course, as it was mentioned by Professor Iwama, the relationship with China. But of course, on that issue, the French have been very straightforward in underlining the fact that NATO was a military alliance directed at the European continent. And of course, we must watch closely what is the impact of Chinese presence in Europe. But to move NATO away from its strategic and military alliance out of Europe and into the whole world is something that the French have always been very cautious about. And that doesn't date to Macron's presidency. It goes back to de Gaulle and all the other French presidents. We must keep the NATO alliance inside of its, I would say, its natural, legal, political, geopolitical framework. And we must strictly abide to this. And I think for us, that's an important element to keep in mind.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for enlightening me on that. Maybe now we'll turn to Celine to sort of bring us home and bridge this sort of transatlantic discussion about NATO and this conversation about how NATO might be able to deal with China, to talk about this Indo-Pacific concept, which in many ways is perhaps explicitly or implicitly designed to counter more proactively many of the concerns that we have about China's rise, and is definitely somewhere where the French and the Japanese overlap and have common interests. So Celine, maybe take the next 10 minutes or so to talk about the French perspective of the Indo-Pacific and how Biden's sort of reinvesting of this Indo-Pacific concept, or doubling down on the Indo-Pacific concept, as we might say, should be approached. So Celine, 10 minutes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Thanks a lot. Yes, I would like to touch upon the opportunity provided by the Biden administration to develop trilateral US, Japan, EU cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. But I would like also to highlight the challenges and maybe provide some concrete ways to advance this cooperation. And I will start by saying with all other speakers that it will be much easier for everybody to work with the Biden administration because of the more normalized posture compared with the previous one. Also, I believe Biden confirmed a strong US commitment to the Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific that would be free and open. If you look at the National Security Council, the team dedicated to the Indo-Pacific is the largest one. And so much will be about maintaining a rules-based order in the region, but it will be also about ensuring that the US maintain its position of strength vis-à-vis China. And this is a word quoted by from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And so in order to do so, the Biden administration recognized the central importance to work with allies and partners. And in doing so, it can count on Japan, of course, who was the first to coin the free and open Indo-Pacific and whisper it in the ears of Donald Trump. And but I believe that the need actually to get Europe on board is clearly now a priority for the Biden administration. Again, in the word of Jake Sullivan, he described the Europeans as being the most crucial partners for that matter. And I think there is a convergence here because, as you know, the Indo-Pacific narrative has been gaining momentum in Europe in recent years. There is a realization that Europe's interests are directly impacted by the development in the Indo-Pacific region. And also, as you know, 3 member states so far, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, published their own Indo-Pacific strategies or outlined. Others 3 countries plus others are now pushing for Brussels to adopt an approach, Indo-Pacific approach at the EU level. And even without talking about using the term of Indo-Pacific, I must say that the Europeans are already de facto significant players in the region on maritime security, for example, but I can name other fields. In addition, I believe the EU-Japan partnerships have been gaining also a lot of amplitude and momentum in the recent years, and it's really, I think, stand out as a real asset for the Biden administration, because the core objective of the EU-Japan partnership is precisely to actively uphold the multilateral rules-based order through its economic, strategic, and connectivity partnership. So there is a clear convergence of interest between the US, the EU, and Japan to maintain stability in the Indo-Pacific by defending the rule of law, especially at sea, to prevent a China-centered order, and to build up a network of partners. But as also other speaker highlighted, I don't think it will be easy at all, because there is no clear, complete alignment between the 3 players. And as previously highlighted, the US partners grew more autonomous in the past 4 years, and they are now resolutely trying to defend their own interests, especially in the context of aggravating US-China competition. And I believe this is what the EU strategic autonomy is about. The High Representative Borrell repeatedly said that the EU wants to go its own way. He called it the Sinatra Doctrine. And he wants to reject, in a way, this framing of a US-China competition. And it's not, as Ambassador Vimon said, it's not about being more distant from the United States, but it's really for the EU to be able to act on its own when it needs to. And as an illustration, of course, we all think about the recent signature of the EU-China investment deal, which sparked a lot of controversy because of the very bad timing, I must say, and the miscommunication also around it. And also because it contradicted, I think, expectations that of a EU becoming less naive and more strategic vis-à-vis China, and of a EU that would make its values prevail over the economic benefits that it would get from this deal. But this investment deal is not done yet, and we have 1 year to negotiate that again and to adopt the text, and we have also 1 year to try to adjust the position and coordinate also with partners on that. Still saying that, I think it's the deal is already creating some tensions with Washington and create an ease, at least certainly in Japan, because I think both the US and Japan would like to try to shape a coalition of democracies, if possible, to increase their leverage vis-à-vis China. And maybe seeing the EU developing this kind of strategic autonomy is seen as an impediment to do that. This said again, I think that Japan share some part of EU's specific approach because both the EU and Japan wants to mitigate in a way the side effect and mitigate the US-China competition. Both the Europe and Japan wants to avoid a complete economic decoupling from China, but at the same time, it would be important to put some restriction in some strategic sectors. They both want to keep a conditional engagement with China and not enter in an overly competitive or confrontational stance. And they both want to offer an alternative to countries that do not want to choose a camp between the US and China. So to sum up the dynamic in this trilateral relation in the Indo-Pacific, I would say that the US is likely to put pressure on the Europeans to engage more in the Indo-Pacific. But it will also need the European cooperation to ultimately lead over China. Europe will be ready to join the effort in the Indo-Pacific, but with caution and while retaining a degree of strategic autonomy. And it will commit because it is in its own interest to be present in the region and to contribute to the stability, but also because it needs to keep the US engaged in European neighborhoods, as we also suggested before. Japan wants to facilitate the commitment of both the US and Europe in the Indo-Pacific. And it will expect the two players to keep a tough line on China. Maybe the US keeping a tough line on military matters, and EU and Europeans to keep a tough line on human rights, values, and norms. So to do so, I think Japan will make efforts to ensure a minimum consensus to allow for coalition of democracy whenever possible. And here I'm thinking especially about the data governance issues with the Japanese governments promoted and proposed the data free flow with trust concept, which was precisely to try to bridge and to reconcile the European and EU approach on data governance and privacy. And Japan will also play an important role of a bridge because it's already plugged to most of the US initiative in the Indo-Pacific. So it would be important for Japan, I believe, to publicize this kind of initiative to the European and maybe to try to encourage the European to join. If I have 1 minute left, I just want to highlight some concrete way to move forward this cooperation in the region. And first, I believe a trilateral dialogue should be set up. It would be very important for information sharing, avoid expectation gap, identified by a priority in cooperation, identify comparative advantages also. And this can be done by, for example, adding Japan to the already existing transatlantic dialogue on China. Second, I believe that the format of cooperation are important and they need to be as flexible as possible. We have to look at ad hoc format of cooperation because this kind of issue-based groupings allows for both greater efficiencies and they are less also controversial, and they facilitate the participation in countries of diverse countries. And here I can refer to the Quad because it might be difficult for some European countries to join formally the Quad because it's perceived by some as a kind of anti-China coalition, but it doesn't mean that from time to time on very specific issues, some coordination is not impossible. So the cooperation can take place in several fields on upholding principles. Of course, freedom of navigation is a keyword here. Europeans are present in the region. This year, we will have 3 European naval dispatch from France, Germany, and the UK, if you count UK in. So there's plenty of opportunities to organize joint passing or joint exercise to show the flag, to uphold this principle. And this also can be done in a more diplomatic manner. The E3 country issued a note verbal regarding the situation in the South China Sea to the UN, for example. On maritime security, I think it's possible to find synergies to work on maritime capacity building of partners in Southeast Asia or Eastern Africa. This is a field where the 3 players have extensive experience. In terms of connectivity, also, there's certainly synergies to be found between the EU initiative on connectivities in the region and, for example, the Blue Dot Network, which is a kind of certification initiative led by the US, and Japan is already in this framework. And above all, maybe to come back to Professor Iwama's points, I think it will be very important to try to reflect on our interdependence with China and the risk of any kind of China economic coercion. And we have to try to guard against this kind of very important risk. And for this, the diversification of global value chain is important. Here again, Japan took the initiative to organize a kind of resilient supply chain with India and Australia. And I believe there are also possibility to plug the European and US in. So I'm already too long, so I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Celine. You've already partly done the job of Ambassador Vimont and Professor MIYAKE that I asked him to do about policy advice. So I'll get back to you, to the both of you as well, to re-ask you this question, and Professor Iwama as well, if you have some concrete policy advice to give. I'll also ask you perhaps that same question. But before that, let me stay on this Indo-Pacific topic, because there's a couple of questions that have come up. Celine, you already sort of talked about sort of some French reservations for joining the Quad. There was one question about that. But there was another question about some prospects for trilateral cooperation between France, Japan, and India. There's also a question here about what added value a European, really a sort of a European Union Indo-Pacific approach would have. We've got some countries here in Europe that have some very clear interests in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, such as France. But other European countries have perhaps no interest or no real value added in contributing to an Indo-Pacific strategy. A country like Poland, which has no assets necessarily to put forward in the region, and no direct interest. So what value added can an EU Indo-Pacific strategy really have? This question is directed towards Ambassador Vimont in the Q&A, but I think we can, we might also be able to ask this question to our Japanese colleagues, and how you see sort of the European articulation of an Indo-Pacific strategy, and what the value added of having a European contribution to the Indo-Pacific might be. So perhaps Celine and Ambassador Vimont, I'll let you answer these questions. Perhaps Ambassador Vimont, so I'll give Celine a chance to breathe. I'll turn to you first on these questions. Go
ahead. Thank you, John. When the question is put about the added value of a EU Indo-Pacific strategy, I would not answer it in that way. I think, first of all, let's be honest, as Celine was underlining it, not all EU member states are interested in the Indo-Pacific for reasons linked to history, it's quite fascinating, as Celine was mentioning, that the 3 European countries that have so far set up an Indo-Pacific strategy at national level have, for many of them, historical links with the region, and therefore, or maritime presence, and therefore have a keen national interest into this. And it's not the same for countries. You mentioned Poland, but one could mention many other EU member states, even if they have gone into the Belt and Road Initiative, and for some of them have come out of that experience with some skepticism. They don't see the major threat for the European Union as being China. For many of them, the major threat is still their closest neighbor, namely Russia. And one has to take that into account. What is therefore needed when we are discussing the whole issue of Indo-Pacific among Europeans is precisely to change the mindset of many of these countries and to have the ability to bring more awareness about what many of the previous speakers were talking about, the strategic thinking about the interdependence between the Indo-Pacific region and the European interest. And one way to look at this is to look at the middle ground, to look at the Middle East, to look at the Gulf region, to look at Iran and many other countries, which are more and more moving into a closer or stronger inclination towards Asia. And for the Europeans to keep some foothold and to be able to keep a link with many of these countries, with our closest neighbors, there is a need to take into account that Indo-Pacific dimension. This is obvious in terms of security, in terms of trade, in terms of industrial cooperation, even in terms today of fighting the pandemic. India being one of the most important pharmaceutical manufacturers, so on and so forth. So this is this kind of awareness and change of mindset, as I was mentioning before, that needs to be introduced into EU discussions. We are starting to do that. And even if you look from the trade perspective, the free trade agreements with Japan and South Korea, the ongoing negotiation with India and Australia, seem to indicate that Europe is moving there. It's slow, as always with Europe. It can be cumbersome also, but the mindset is changing, and we need to allow it to go on. Some countries will lead there. France, certainly, Germany to some extent, maybe not for the same reasons. As Professor Iwama was as she was mentioning Philip Stevens' piece in the Financial Times, of course, there are not exactly the same point of view and the same approach between Germany and France. One is more focused on economy and trade. The other one is more focused on security, France, to name it. But it is the combination of both that makes an added value at the end of the day. So this is where we're slowly moving. We're not yet there, but Europe is always a slow process, an ongoing process, and we have to accept that. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. Celine, maybe you want to provide some really quick reactions to this question on European value added in the Indo-Pacific and prospects for a France, India, Japan trilateral cooperation. There's also been a question on Australia that's thrown into the mix. I don't know if you want to say a few words about potential naval cooperation with Australia in the Indo-Pacific context as well. The good news is we have a lot of questions, so you're all there a lot of folks are interested. So I'll turn it over to Celine, and then we'll try to knock some of these questions out as quickly as we can. Go ahead, Celine.
Sure. Thanks, John. Well, I really agree with what Ambassador Vimont just said about the European approach to the region. I think we should not, stay focused on the EU level per se. There are steps now to try to overcome this issue of reaching a consensus between all members of the EU to try to advance on very specific issue, and the Indo-Pacific might be one. So it would be also possible to try to develop some cooperation between the interested countries within the EU. In the Indo-Pacific, we must not maybe wait for to achieve any consensus between all member states on this, because we know that it will be very difficult for historic reason because of the different countries have different kind of relationship with China as well. But the value added of the European presence in the region, I think it's quite obvious. I think the key development now is try to build partnerships and coalition and engage as much like-minded partners as possible in order to promote our joint values, principles, and keep the stability in the region. So if the Europeans are there, that's a plus. I thought that it's Marianne Perrondoise who asked the question, so I'm sure she knows much more than me about already what is the EU is doing in terms of maritime security in the region, maritime capacity building, in terms of maritime domain awareness, also connectivity, and so on. So again, a lot of good side. And I just wanted to refer to a very recent report published by ISEAS about the public opinion poll in Southeast Asia that shows that for the Southeast Asian countries, the EU and Japan stand out as the two most trusted partners. So if you look at the polls, it's quite remarkable. So it's also a value added, to get the European here, because they are trusted, and they are trusted as Japan is. So there is a kind of natural synergy and convergence to find here. I will not go into too much details regarding the France partnership with India, Australia, and Japan and others in the Indo-Pacific, just to say that it is the French approach to try to network its partners in the region. So we've seen trilateral dialogues going on between France, Japan, and India, France, India, and Australia. And we try to elevate this to track 1.5 and try also to step up the interoperability between our forces by multiplying the opportunities for joint exercise altogether. And again, maritime security is a key focus of this partnership, because it's obviously very significant interest for all the partners.
Okay, great. Thank you, Celine. I've noticed that that we're actually running up on time. Perhaps if you'll indulge me a little bit, we'll go perhaps 5 minutes over time, because I'd like to have our Japanese colleagues respond to this question about European contributions. But there are also a number of other questions that I'll try to group together very quickly. Unfortunately, I can't get to them all, but there's sort of a theme that's coming out here that we've discussed about economic dependence and interdependence and opening the avenues for coercion, particularly in relation to China. So there's this sort of conversation about whether or not it's fair to criticize the Europeans on the investment agreement when Japanese and other Asian colleagues are colleagues. Countries are concluding agreements like the RCEP. And at the same time, we've got industrial players in both France and Japan that are unwilling to divest from China, that are on the contrary looking to invest and double down on their investments in China. So how can we possibly manage these competing geopolitical and economic interests in some ways? So there's this question about how to deal with the, potential risks of economic coercion in relation to China. There's also another question about related to the United States and U.S. extraterritoriality. We saw a significant uptick in the use of sanctions and whatnot under an extraterritorial application of U.S. legislation under Trump. What can we expect under the Biden administration? Do we expect this to continue along the same lines? I think perhaps so. Here we'll stick with our Japanese colleagues. Perhaps I'll give you just 1 minute each, very short time. You can play with that a little bit more if you like. But then I'll give it back to our Ambassador Vimont and perhaps Celine for some very concluding remarks of 15 to 20 seconds each. So with those questions, I'll sort of do a round. Perhaps we'll start with Professor Iwama, go to Professor MIYAKE, and then I'll hand it to Celine, and we'll finish with Ambassador Vimont. So any last comments you'd like to talk about on any of these questions, or anything that you think we missed? Let's do a round. Professor Iwama, why don't you start us off?
Right, 1 minute. About RCEP and the investment treaty, as I said, we won't be able to decouple ourselves totally economically from China, but we have to do it in a clever way, and then we have to be careful about the message that our decisions send. And I think with this investment treaty, Biden explicitly saying that he wants more consultation, I think it gave the wrong kind of message by the timing and the way it was rushed through. Alliance, and then about the Eastern European countries, actually Japan has a very good relationship now with the Baltic countries, precisely because they're very much focused on the strategic security aspect of their foreign policy. And I myself have been to Lithuania in 2019, and they're also very interested about talking about China. So I don't really agree that the smaller non-naval countries has no role in this dialogue. The other thing is that the rule of law perspective, it's also, of course, the bigger naval countries like Japan, France, UK, Italy can cooperate in the freedom of navigation operations, but the rule of law starts at home, and many of the Southeast Asian countries have a long way to go to establish a rule of law system in their domestic society. And I think we have a lot to do together in the form of capacity building. I mean, we're doing at GRIPS, we're doing capacity building for Coast Guards, but you can also do it for police and other judicial institutions. So I think there's a lot we can do together, not just pure military, but also taking security in a broader sense. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Iwama. So Miyake-san, the floor is on to you. There's also a number of folks are jumping in with a question.
I'd like to tell my European friends the following. First of all, in my view, probably what we are experiencing now is a period of severe, big geostrategic rivalry, maybe once or twice in a century. It's a huge transformation is going on, probably not in Europe, but in this part of the world. And Iwama-san said that it's so difficult to convince the Europeans why China is so bad, that kind of thing. No, it doesn't mean that there are no strategic thinkers in Europe. There are so many strategic thinkers in Europe. The problem is that we have two problems, Russia and China, while Europe has one. Okay, so this strategic sort of a difference creates some gap for European and Japanese strategic thinkers to fill in. But I think I'm very optimistic. One more minute, please. Economic interest, China, etc., fine. But Quad is not alliance, and Indo-Pacific is not strategy yet. You see, it is a vague sort of platform, a forum. Yeah, but what we should keep in mind is this: it's not whether or not we should choose one of the two, China or the United States, economy or geopolitics. I think what is most important is that we are entering an era where the universal values, democracy, freedom, rule of law, human rights, humanitarianism, these values are shared by so many like-minded nations. And there are revisionist nations, maybe some in Europe, many in Asia, maybe, but there are so many big, powerful nations. They are revisionist now. So what we should keep in mind is that what we are witnessing is us trying the efforts, international efforts, to try to find a solution to convince the revisionists to come back to the international community, which shares those universal values. So this is the standpoint. So I think many Europeans will eventually understand what I am talking about, and eventually will join us globally.
Right, great. Thank you, Professor MIYAKE, for taking this long view. I think we've already coined a term for that here in Europe. We call it systemic rivalry, which is still sort of a vague concept that we've sort of thrown out since 2019 in dealing with China, but it's definitely become part of the conversation here in Europe. So we have a lot more to discuss with you, our Japanese colleagues, on this question. So we'll finish it up. But Celine, I'll give you very briefly the floor if you have any famous last words, and maybe I'll allow Ambassador Vimont to finish this up.
Thank you, John. Very, very quickly on how to reconcile the economic and geopolitics. It's not easy. I think Europe is now trying to struggle to reconcile and to look at that, to try to protect its economy while trying to maintain a kind of functional relations with China. And I think we should look maybe at Japan and what Japan is doing with China for years, because there are clearly security issues between the two countries, and despite that, Japan is still, having a very close economic cooperation with China. But I think it would be important to identify the strategic sectors in which we need really to put our effort to diversify the investment, to try to protect these sectors from some predatory moves, and be careful that this economic cooperation is not detrimental to our interests and principle. That will be my final words. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you. So, Ambassador Vimont, why don't you round us out here with some famous last words?
Very briefly, I would like to reassure to some extent Professor MIYAKE, because I think we are Europeans getting much more aware of what China represents. But here again, this is a long time process, because we are all the victims of our neighborhood. Japan has a different neighborhood from the European neighborhood. We are very close to Russia. We are very close to the Middle East. And therefore, it's a natural way for the Europeans to look this neighborhood as being the major threat for them. And this is maybe where we have a difference of perception with China, with Japan on China. But yet, the 2019 communication you just mentioned, John, seems to me to be a very good reminder about how Europe is moving. And I think that's important. But one additional point I would like to make, the fear or the concern one may have with this strategic rivalry we have been discussing, and which is very much there. There is a change of paradigm going on at the moment. But the risk, in my opinion, is that we must be careful as we look at this shift and at this big change that is happening, is that we lose somewhere in a run-up to this growing rivalry what we were trying to build with the multilateral system. The multilateral system is already highly fragmented. It is fractured. And by moving towards more rivalry, by creating coalitions one against the other, we are on the verge of creating more difficulty for the multilateral system. And at the end of the day, of breaking it up entirely. We have to be careful. There is a need to find patiently, painfully, common grounds between all these rivals. And I think Europe is in this position with Japan precisely, of the two together being able to try to keep this common ground open for better days when they come ahead. Today it's too difficult, but let's not lose this opportunity for Japan and Europe to be the reasonable voice in this strategic confrontation. I'll stop there, John.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for finishing us up with some food for thought. And the good news is that the audience has stuck with us for the most part, even though we went well over time, which is a good sign that the conversation was engaging and interesting, and a sign that we need to continue the discussion further. So thank you to all four of our panelists for taking the time to share your thoughts. And I hope to see you again very soon. Thanks also to the audience for sticking around. Thank you, Celine, for organizing this. And we'll see you again soon. Take care. Thank you all.
Bye.